Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
All right, it is time to talk NHL Trade Deadline. Joining me to do so, Zach Dooley. How are you doing today, Zach?
Jesse, I'm a little tired.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Early start here in El Segundo, but I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm okay. Now, unfortunately, I was not able to attend this morning's media availability. I was having a meeting with my oncologist, so I'm tired for a totally different set of reasons.
I should be not complaining, is what you're.
No, honestly, it was a pretty boring day. No procedures, just a meeting, and just me basically running down the list of things I never should have Googled in the first place, and being told not to stop Googling things. But the Kings loan trade, a third, if I have this correctly, a third round pick for Andrei Kuzmenko and a 7th round pick. Is it Andrei Kuzmenko? Did I even get his name right?
You did. Nice research there.
Thanks.
And the only other detail is Philadelphia retained.
Oh, yes, retaining 50%.
Kuzmenko's cap hit, which ultimately I don't know if mattered, but it may have been ultimately necessary, but small detail. They got that player.
I think it did matter because he was making $5.5 million. And I understand that there's only so much time left in the season, so it's not really $5.5 million. But when your cap math gets complicated and fuzzy, but the Kings only had so much cap space to begin with. And I have seen varying different reports. You know, now that cap friendly is dead and we're relying on multiple different replacements, and you know, Puckpedia has like 2 different numbers, and I don't know how they reach. Anyway, it obviously mattered because it happened, because they did it. I want to jump straight to the best possible interpretation of this trade, which is that Kuzmenko scored 39 goals in the 2022-23 season. He is a right-hand shot, which is obviously an area that Kings fans and Kings executives obviously identified as a area of need. And so the Kings get a guy with a history of scoring goals who shoots right.
Yep.
And it costs very little.
I think especially when you look at the prices around the league, right? I mean, we saw
my God,
young NHL players change teams. We saw top prospects change teams. We saw first round picks change teams. And the Kings got a guy who checks the right shot forward box. He checks the power play box for a 3rd round pick with the 7th coming back. Now, not a perfect player, right? Because if he was, the Kings wouldn't have gotten him for that package. I mean, he scored 39 goals in Vancouver 2 seasons ago, and he's now been on 4 teams in 18 months. So there's obviously something going on there. And the trends have kind of been, this is a guy who comes to a team, his offense is outstanding immediately. And for whatever reason, it hasn't sustained in that 2nd season. But for this player in this situation, the Kings have him through the end of this season. He was traded last year from Vancouver to Calgary midseason and scored 14 goals in 29 games. That's like a 40-goal pace. And if you look at where his goals come from, it is very consistent that this is a net front guy in power play situations who is very shifty. He's very crafty. He gets open in front. He can deflect. He has very good hands in tight spaces. He does a lot of things that the Kings have lacked specifically on the power play this year. So maybe it's not the name that we thought of. Maybe it's not the biggest name or the name that you thought you wanted. And I understand that. But it did seem to be one of the better value deals on the day, I thought.
I have said as much on social media. I obviously don't understand the trade deadline because the amount of cost that teams were willing to spend to get marginally better is wild to me. I still don't understand the Florida trade of Spencer Knight and a first for Seth Jones, although I am told by reliable opinions that Seth Jones is better than I think he is. Tampa Bay traded 2 first-round picks for 2 players who are fine, but I don't think are. I mean, I guess we'll see. The Rantanen deal, obviously, two trades of Rantanen in a short span. So, I mean, costs were all over the place, and I was actually quite happy to hear Rob Blake say in his media availability that they didn't feel that future draft picks were the right way to go when it came to acquiring players. Now, I'm not sure that they would have been able.
Sorry to cut you off, but he actually said the opposite of that.
Oh, did he? I thought he said
that the Kings were willing to part with draft capital. They were not willing to part with young NHL players.
Okay,
specifically Brant Clark.
Well, then I guess I heard that wrong.
So the Kings were willing to part with their picks to acquire players, but they were not in the mood to trade a player like Clark for a rental or, in fact, for anybody.
Yeah, so, well, then I guess I should say I'm glad they didn't, because you see, yes, Florida, has built this cup winning team with trades and free agency, but let's see if they win again before we start, touting this as like the strategy to follow. Anyway,
we'll add one thing too. I looked at, you didn't mention this one deal, but like to me, it was the Brock Nelson trade was the one that stood out to me, because the Avalanche traded the equivalent for the Kings of their first and Liam Greentree.
Right.
The players traded Callum Ritchie, taken like 1 pick after Greentree, has elevated his stock since the draft as Greentree has. And like Brock Nelson is a damn good player. Really, really strong 2C, right? Like he's going to make that team better. But he's a rental. Maybe they've already are down the road an extension, fine. But that's a lot to give up, right? For a guy who in theory might just be with you for one playoff run and who you've never seen integrated into your group. I think he's a veteran. He's a good player. He's a guy I want on my team. But if you're the Kings, I can't see many people being happy if the Kings traded their first and Liam Greentree, who's had a really strong season after being a first-round pick last year, for a player with no term. So that for me was like, okay, that's the going rate for a quality second-line player. The Kings didn't do that. They took a different approach. They were in on some big-name players, right? But from what Blake said, it sounded like, yes, they had a lot of conversations specifically about high-quality offensive wingers, but for either situations outside of their control or within their control, meaning the price was too high and they didn't feel comfortable parting with certain young players to get immediate help, they didn't wind up making that additional move.
I mean, I received a number of calls on Kings Talk, and I've gotten a lot of texts and DMs from people asking about big trades and should they do this and should they do that. And my position has kind of been, they built this team in the offseason to play the way that it plays. And Jim Hiller coaches the way that Jim Hiller believes that he should. And they put priorities on the things that they believe that are important. And even if there was, because Spence was out of the lineup on Tuesday night, there was a lot of rumors that, Spence is obviously being held out for a trade. And, how wonderful from some people's perspective, because, hey, there is a certain impulse, and I understand it because it is entertaining when trades happen, but there is an impulse to want activity regardless of how good or bad it is. And, look, I totally get it, because by the end of my hospital stay, sorry to make this always about my health, but at the end of my hospital stay, I was just like, look, give me a diagnosis. I don't care if it's bad. I just can't handle another week of not knowing. So I get it. People, especially after a run of games, and Rob Blake mentioned the poor play of recent, but I just think that this team is who they are. They have prioritized what they have prioritized. They have crafted an identity. And even if they had somehow found a way to swing a trade for a Brock Nelson or a Mikko Rantanen or whomever, I don't think that changes the identity of the team. And so even if Jordan Spence was on the trading block, he obviously wasn't, and Rob Blake talked about his future with the team and their desire for him to stay with the team, at least in the short term. With Spence out of the lineup, they still only played Brant Clark however many minutes they did, right? Like, just because a trade might have happened, and like the Kuzmenko trade happened, presumably he will play in a top 6 role. Presumably he will play on the power play. But they are still a defensive first team. They're still a defensive oriented team. Jim Hiller is not going to suddenly say, oh, we have Andrei Kuzmenko? Well, let's completely rework. I mean, you heard Rob Blake say, what does tomorrow look like for Kuzmenko, assuming that they can get him to LA in time to play in the game? And he said he's got to go through a bunch of meetings. He's got to go through a bunch of this is what we do on the power play. This is what we do on the penalty kill. This is what we do 5-on-5. Like, he is going to have to adapt to what the Kings do. The Kings are not going to rework their entire identity around a new player, no matter who that player is.
And I think that it's just so much harder to do that than I think people think it is. I remember asking, I think it was Mikey Anderson a while back of hey, you guys made these system changes that on paper were designed to be more offensive. You got away from the 1-3-1. Certain concepts were designed. They said publicly, right? We're trying to score more goals than we did in the past. But what happened was that they got even better defensively and
right.
The offense remained stagnant or got a little bit worse. And he said, look, we have a group of players here who have been trained to do things a certain way. It's hard to just switch that for an entire team that's done things one way for him since he came into the league, right? And for others, it's been even longer. For Kempe, for Kopitar, for Doughty, since they came into the league with this team was 8, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So you can't just flip a switch and say, okay, guys, we're going to score more goals now. Let's go. It doesn't work that way. You have to change things over time. And March 7th practice is not the time to do it. It's just not going to work. So they can acquire an offensive player to help two areas of the game that have not met expectations, the offense and the power play. They simply haven't been good enough, right? And this player should help. He's not a savior, but he should play on the power play. He should play in the top 9. His focus is offense first. Blakey said as much, right? He said, this is a guy we acquired for his offensive talents, not, the defensive stuff. He's going to have to figure out how to do it within the Kings system and with players who know how to play the Kings system. And he's going to have to produce on the power play because the Kings are 30th in the NHL on the power play. They have 21 goals. This dude scored 14 power play goals 2 years ago. That's 2/3 of the entire team in LA this year.
Yeah.
On paper, this guy should help, but I agree that it's not just going to all of a sudden change everything at once.
I do want to briefly touch on the power play because I think it is now reached a point where it's beyond not good enough. It's actually now reached a point in the last game against St. Louis where it's actually ceding momentum to the other team.
Agreed. Yeah.
And that's when it becomes, okay, we need to, it'd be nice if it was better, to, oh no, this is the kind of thing that costs you a playoff game and maybe a series.
It's kind of, we're approaching, I think 21-22 power play.
Yes.
Where 22-23, the Kings power play was sick. It scored a ton of goals in the playoffs and the Kings lost it in other ways. 21-22, that first year, the power play goals were 9-1 or something.
And again, it was an issue.
Momentum all year.
Yeah. And that to me is the issue, is that late in a game, as the third period against St. Louis, the Kings have the power play to start the period. And, the cynical Kings fan response is well, more like powerless play. We didn't, decline it, whatever. Ha, ha, ha.
Yeah.
But then the first 10 minutes of the third period are all St. Louis because the power play not only wasn't successful, but it also, I mean, they said it on the broadcast. When your power play isn't successful, the other team begins to target you and go at you on the power play because they know you're not. So hopefully, and I am reluctant to believe that one player can change that, but hopefully I'm wrong. And hopefully Kuzmenko does that. Now, I also have to add that I find it mildly amusing that there was all this talk about getting a right shot forward. And so they got a right shot forward who plays on the left side. Not that it matters, but
Does he play the left?
Every highlight I've seen has him scoring from the left side, and he's listed as a left winger on every website I've seen. I don't know if he's capable of switching sides. He comes from he played in Russia for years, and I imagine they probably play a more positionless spot. But I mean, just given the history of the Kings' lack of right shooting forwards and the fact that they had guys who liked to, they've got Adrian Kempe on the right side. He shoots left. That has at times pushed Laferriere to the left side, even though whatever. It's one of those silly things I'm obsessed with that doesn't really matter.
Did you hear Jim Hiller's avail yesterday?
I heard bits and pieces of it, but I haven't sat down and watched the whole thing.
He estimated that the power play has cost the team 8 to 10 points in the standings this year.
That's
and
rough.
It speaks to your point, right? Like it is beyond not good enough. Like it is. That's the difference between the Kings being in third and the Kings being tied for first.
Yeah.
Like that's huge, right? Like the Vancouver game, the most recent one for me, like the Blues one, sure. Like I actually didn't watch a ton of the third period. I was working on a couple things, but you're right. But the Vancouver game, right? The Kings score a goal. Vancouver challenges. They lose the challenge. It's a terrible challenge. The Kings get a power play, don't score. They get a 4-on-3 in OT. Great play by Fiala to draw it. They don't score. They don't get a ton of chances. Like that's a firm point lost. Yeah. That should have been 2 points for sure on a night they didn't even play all that well.
Yeah.
Power play cost them directly. And I haven't gone back and looked at every single game this year, but I'm going to guess that Jim Hiller has, and he has pinpointed moments where the power play has cost this team 1 or 2 points, or at least he feels that it's cost them 1 or 2 points. And you just can't have that in a playoff series because you're not playing for points. You're playing for wins and losses.
Yeah, well, that's
playoffs is worth a lot more than 2 points.
And like, that's the danger, and I go back to that 2021-22 series, game 6, the Kings had what was probably a lucky 3-2 series lead.
Yeah.
And game 6 at home in the third period, the Kings have a power play. And
right?
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know, 6 minutes left, 10 minutes left, whatever in the third period, and they don't score, and you're just like, oh, come on. And then Edmonton winds up winning the game, and then winds up winning the series, and you're like, well, you don't want to look back on it and say it's as simple as, if they score that power play goal, the whole thing is different, but I don't know, maybe it is. Like, that's how you lose series. Series are lost on the weirdest things, right?
Last year, game 4, right? You look at game 4, the Kings lose 1-0. The Oilers scored that 1 goal on the PP in a game that the Kings dominated by every statistical metric, right? It was like, 5-on-5 is about as good as we could do. And they still got it because their power play scored.
Yep.
The Kings didn't. And it's reared its ugly head before. And there's still time, you'd think. Hiller also talked about how last year he thought the power play was going at its best in the last month and a half once Arvidsson came back, and then it reached the playoffs against the Oilers and it went cold. So they have to hope for the opposite. Maybe Kuzmenko could be a missing piece. Maybe he puts other players into different positions and it gets going. You got to hope for that, I guess. Like, you can't count on it because past precedent this year has been that it's been a weak link for this team. But it has to get a little bit better if the Kings want to get to where they want to get to.
The timelines don't match up identically, but this reminds me of a trade the Kings made in 2010 for Frederick Modin. And Frederick, I want to say it was like, I don't know. I think it was future considerations that never even wound up triggering. But Modin was, a guy that had scored 30 goals in the league in the past. He was not at that point in his career anymore. He scored 5 points, 3 goals, 2 assists, 5 points in 20 games. And then in the playoffs, 3 goals, 1 assist, and 4 points in 6 games in the playoffs. And the reason I bring it up is that the cost was low, the possibility was high, and he came in and basically performed well. And it's very easy for fans to look back because the Kings lost in the first round in 2010. Like I said, the timelines don't really match up because that was the first time the team had even made the playoffs in like 8 years, I think. And at this point, the Kings are 3 years in a row playoff team. But that's the kind of performance that I'm looking for. And it doesn't sound like a lot, I get it, but like I think people make the mistake at the trade deadline of going, well, player X has scored X amount of goals, so we're going to get X amount of goals out of that player. And it's like, well, no, she's only getting him for 20 games.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
even if you're getting the 39 goal version of Kuzmenko, that's 10 at most over the final.
At most.
20. Yeah.
And let's face it, he is probably not that guy anymore. If he were, he wouldn't be on his third team in a year.
Jim Hiller, it was a really good chat yesterday on a few things, but he talked about like, look, sometimes you bring in a guy and on paper you think it's like the perfect fit, but like you don't know till you know. You know, like you don't know, like, okay, say he goes right on the line with Kopitar Kempe. Like you might say on paper, like, in the video game, they've got the perfect chemistry. Do they? I don't know. Like you got to see how it goes. Like, does that player, is he the best version of himself on this team or isn't he? And sometimes you don't think he is and he is. And sometimes you think it's a great fit and it turns out not to be. So have to hope he can come in and hit the ground running because the Kings do need help in the areas that he excels in.
And I don't know, this may be a positive, it may be a negative. I guess we'll find out. I'm not even necessarily sure, Rob Blake mentioned that, with Jim Hiller, Rob Blake said, like, we think we know where he's going to play, but Jim Hiller, like,
yep,
give it 3 minutes and it'll be different. I'm not entirely sure that I know that the Kings know what their ideal top 11 or 12 forwards were before the trade, much less after the trade. Like,
you could see a world too where he comes in and plays on the fourth line tomorrow because he doesn't know the system.
Right.
He got off a plane. He's tired. Like where he is tomorrow too might not be where he is the next day, might not be where he is in a week or game 82, hopefully game 83. Just it's fickle.
But like, I just, like what if I, asked you on pain of punishment, what line will play the most minutes between now and the end of the season? What 3-player combination? You don't know. I don't think Jim Hiller knows. Like, I don't think the Kings have any idea. Which is maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I guess we'll find out.
Like I know what I would say. You probably know what you would say, but like wouldn't put my life on it, right?
Honestly, I don't have any idea because there are games like the last game against St. Louis, for example. If you look at the minutes distribution for the lines, the Kopitar line played, I want to say like 6 minutes and change, and Byfield, Fiala, and Laferriere, and then Jeannot, Moore, and Fogle. I think both those lines played 11 minutes. But if you go back and look at it, Turcotte didn't play most of, if not the entire third period. So that line that played 6 minutes is like, all right, well, then there was a different line playing it. So like, I don't know. I have no idea. Anyway, that's that's the sort of theme of the season is I have no idea.
One thing that I like about Jim Hiller that I think some people probably don't, and I do understand it, is like I think he's willing to try some stuff out, see if he likes it or not, even if he doesn't intend to do it long term. Like I think he likes to see, hey, I think this will work. Does it work? And he picks certain moments in the game, usually when the team is not playing well, to try them out. Remember when we had him on that podcast? He's not making anything up in the moment. He knows what he's going to do if something goes wrong, right? So you wonder if we could see similar things with Kuzmenko, right? Like maybe he starts with Kopitar, but what could Fiala, Byfield, Kuzmenko be cool? It could be.
Who knows?
And maybe he's got it in his head and he's going to try it, or maybe you know what, we really think he's going to click with Kopitar, or hey, maybe we think he goes well with Danault, but we'd like to know where he's at. But hey, if we're down and we're not playing well, let's try him with Danault, see if it works. Like I think that's how Jim Hiller thinks. And I think we could see him in different spots and hopefully it clicks. And if it doesn't, then look, I think the cost paid was pretty low. And I think it's a low risk situation when you look at, the acquisition cost.
The cost paid in real draft stock, the cost paid was low. In sort of mental emotional cost, it's nothing. It's a third round pick in 2027. When the 2027 draft rolls around 2.5 years from now, or 2 years from now, assuming that you and I both still work here, you and I will have probably a dozen conversations where I turn to you and go, how many picks do we have? Where'd the third round pick go? And you'll roll your eyes and you'll say, hey, there's a list.
hopefully Kuzmenko's in the side of the building.
Right. Sure.
That time. But
I mean, like it's right? 2 years from now. It's a third round pick 2 years from now. Every year, every team has picks beyond the first round that are no longer theirs. And now that trades are getting more and more complicated, I saw, was it the Brock Nelson trade? No, it was the Tampa trade where there's all these protections thrown in.
Yep.
And so it's like, if this and then the pick transfers, and if that, then, blah, blah, blah. So it's, like I said, emotionally, it's nothing. In real draft stock, it's a third round pick 2 years from now, which if you really need to get another third round pick, which I don't know why you would, but if you feel for whatever reason that you absolutely need an additional third round pick, Lord knows there's ways to get them.
Look, I used to get very protective of the picks, and then I saw how easily the Kings acquired a second.
Yeah.
Like they moved down 5 spots, got the player they wanted and Carter George, and was
right.
like, oh, like they could just do this every year.
Well, and now, all you have to do is if you have a retention spot and some extra cap space, just volunteer to hoard cap space.
Buy a fourth for free.
Yeah, exactly. So there's options. One change that I think we may be looking forward to, because Rob Blake mentioned it, I didn't hear if Jim Hiller addressed it, but I saw that the D pairs looked more traditional, and Rob Blake addressed it, and he said, we like Edmondson with Clark. So I thought that was an interesting wrinkle.
I think it also puts to bed some of the notion of like, well, can the two of them be in the lineup at the same time with Doughty?
Yeah.
And this is the D we envisioned start of the year, right? Anderson, Doughty, Edmondson, Clark, Gavrikov, Spence.
Yep.
It's tough on Mo Verara, who I think has really come up and done a nice job. But I think that you have to try and keep letting Clark, and like they have upside, they have offensive ability. Like you got to see what they can do together in the lineup. And Mo's going to be there. You know what Mo's going to give you. He's solid. He's not going to beat you most nights, minus maybe that turnover in Chicago. Solid player. It's tough on him. The Kings will probably play some 11-7 down the stretch, which will work Mo in. But I liked that alignment today on the blue line for sure.
And, listen, you know how much affection I have for Jacob Muvarari, my movie buddy. If you're going to have all of this
swirl,
yeah, there you go. Actually, I think that might be closer to how you pronounce his name. If you're going to have all this swirling angst and Sturm and Drang about Clark and Spence both being in the lineup and neither one of them getting traded and blah, 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 then you got to play them. Right. And so this plays them. And in a perfect world, obviously the Kings want a left-right pairing where the left all sort of mimic each other and the right all sort of mimic each other. Yeah. And as Rob Blake said, entering a season and assuming that you're going to play 82 games with the same 6 guys is not going to happen. So
look, none of us could have predicted how good Anderson Gavrikov would have been. And I understand too why, if you're the coaches, you're saying like, I don't want to break this up, man. Like this is our rock for 45 games. Like I want to keep this together. And ultimately, I don't know if it's the best deployment to get your best guys in the lineup, which is hard, but I get it to an extent, right? Like I get that it's not traditional. I get that it's lefty-lefty, but like those dudes played 25 a night together against the other team's best players for a long time. And the Kings played quite well with those guys together. So like, I get it, like why you wouldn't want to lose that.
And I want to hone in on that phrase. I get it, because I've been having multiple conversations. I've been a little bit chippy with fans lately, and I apologize. I'm going through some stuff and it's torn down my filters probably more than it should. But I just want to harp on this one thing. If you're going to start a conversation, stay in that conversation. Like if you have an issue with, if you don't like defense, and I've seen people just out and out, flat out say, I don't like defensive hockey. I want to see more goals. That's what I want to watch. Listen, I'm not going to okay, I get it. That's what you like. I don't. I have heard the arguments that scoring is up. I've seen the numbers. It's up from 2.73 goals a game to 3, which is an increase that makes me just sort of shrug and go, okay, technically you are correct. Goals are up, but it's not 2.3 to 4.5. It's not 2.3 to 8 a game. It's not a different sport, but whatever. That's a whole other thing. If you have an issue with how management has constructed this roster, if you have an issue with how the coaching staff chooses to prioritize what what style they play, that's one conversation. Don't bring up whether or not they should make a huge trade. And then if I say, no, I don't think they should, and here's why, tell me one playoff series in 10 years. I go, okay, that's a different conversation. That's a totally different conversation. A conversation that I may or may not be interested in engaging in, because there's some that I will and some that I won't and some that I simply cannot. But just stay in the conversation you started is my one plea to fans.
Look, I know how many playoff series they've won in that time.
Right.
How many playoff series. It's not a fact to either of us. That is, right. We know how many. We know what the success has been at that time of the year.
But like I said, it's just not fair. Like I said, conversationally, and I get it. I'm a media member complaining about fans and I shouldn't do it. But like I said, if you're going at me and you say, I'm bored, I want a big trade, look at the NBA, this is boring. Look at what Dallas did. Look at what Vegas did. Look at what Colorado did. Look. And I go, yeah, I don't think the Kings are in a position to do that, to pull it off. And B, I don't think they're in a position where even if they could pull it off, it would be useful or helpful. In fact, I think it would be harmful. And they go, yeah, well, all these 8 other things. And I'm like, cool. That's a summertime conversation, right? I had a conversation with somebody on Twitter where we were just I thought we were nitpicking details, but then the question became, well, you're just saying that adding an offensive player can't change a team. And I was like, well, not if the coaching staff doesn't. He's like, so you're saying adding Connor McDavid in the offseason wouldn't change the team? And I was like, well, okay. Now we're just talking fantasy. Like, yes, adding Connor McDavid in the offseason would, of course, fundamentally alter everything about how the team operates. It would change the priorities. It would change timelines. It would change financial structures, coaching. So yes, that would change everything, but that's, but if my aunt had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. So what are we talking about? Anyway, my last plea. Zach, thanks for joining me. I think we're going to wrap it up here before I talk myself off a cliff. Another trade deadline come and gone. 20 or so games left on the schedule, and the Kings solidly in a playoff spot.
Kuz.
Yeah. The Kuzmenko era begins. All right. Thanks for joining me, Zach. Thanks for listening, Kings fans. We'll talk to you soon.